All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining. I'm going to give everybody just another moment. We still have a lot of people joining the Zoom, so we're just going to wait one moment while we get everybody logged in.
Buenas tardes. Vamos a esperar un momento hasta que todas las personas lleguen a la junta. Ya se están entrando la mayoría.
Okay, and with that, we will go ahead and get started. So thank you again for joining us today for this informational community session for the Zero Emission Passenger Rail and Trail Project, which you may also hear us refer to as the ZEPRT project for short. My name is Tiffany Mendoza, and I will be moderating tonight's meeting. First, I'm going to go over a few Zoom logistics. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the project website, along with the recordings of the previous sessions, which are available there now. The meeting is being hosted in both English and Spanish. In just a few minutes, we will launch the Spanish audio channel. At that time, you'll be able to click the interpretation button, which will show as a globe icon in the Zoom taskbar. A menu will appear and you may select your preferred language. I'll now pause so that our translator, Isidra, can translate this message into Spanish.
Buenas tardes. La reunión de hoy va a tener interpretación simultánea en español. En breves momentos abriremos el canal de español. Ustedes van a poder entrar allí porque verán en la parte de abajo de Zoom un icono del globo terráqueo. Al hacer allí, podrán escoger el idioma de su preferencia, español, y también en ese momento les recomendamos que pongan el audio original en silencio para escuchar el idioma español solamente de manera continua. Gracias.
Thank you, Isidra. At this time, we will open the Spanish language channel. We do ask that all participants choose an audio channel by clicking either the Spanish or English button. And we do ask that even if you are choosing English, you select the English channel to ensure that you don't miss any of tonight's announcements. We also have closed captioning available. If you'd like to use this option, please click the CC icon in the Zoom taskbar, and you can select to view the subtitles on the screen or select live transcript to see the full transcript on the side panel. And lastly, if you need any technical support, you can click on the Q&A button and then describe the issue there, and our tech team will help you. And tonight's meeting format includes a presentation followed by a question and answer session. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation. You can do so by using that Q&A button in the meeting taskbar and then typing in your question. For those of you who are attending in person at the RTC conference room, you can write your questions on the paper provided and hand them to the RTC staff member in the room. They will submit your questions via the Q&A for you. And with that, at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Riley Gerbrandt, who is the project manager for the Santa Cruz County Regional Transportation Commission.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. My name is Riley Gerbrandt. As Tiffany mentioned, I'm with the RTC. I am the project manager for the Zero Emission Passenger Rail and Trail Project. And thank you very much, everyone who's joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your attendance and participate in this important project. Next slide, please. So the purpose of today is to provide an update and an overview of the ridership projections and the capital and operating maintenance costs estimates that have been prepared for the project. As Tiffany mentioned, we will have a Q&A session after the webinar for community questions and input and feedback. We do encourage those who have questions already in mind to go ahead and submit those questions early in the webinar this afternoon so that we can incorporate those into our queue for the question and answers for this afternoon. Next slide. So brief before we get into the nuts and bolts on the ridership forecasts and on the cost estimates, we'll provide a brief overview of the project for those who may not know the project as well or who are new here today. So the Zero Emission Passenger Rail and Trail Project aims to provide new high-capacity passenger rail service on approximately 22 miles of the Santa Cruz branch line from Pajaro to the city of Santa Cruz. It also proposes 12 new miles of the Coastal Rail Trail. Those are segments 13 through 20, as well as the Capitola Trestle segment 11 portion, which we call Capitola Trestle segment 11 phase 2. On the screen here and on the slide is the project limits. The rail alignment is shown indicated in the blue alignment, as the trail alignment is shown in the green alignment. Next slide. And here is our project milestone graphic. We have a little bit of an error on the graphic here. We have moved the star to the bottom of the page. But as you see, that we have 4 different project milestones, and we are entering the 4th project milestone for the project. And I guess maybe we're just before the 4th one is set to begin, so maybe the star's in the correct location after all. But as you see, the draft project concept report is going to be coming out very soon, and the preliminary cost estimates and the ridership projections are part of that. Next slide. All right, and with that, we will transition into the ridership forecast update, and Matt Haynes from Fair & Pierce will be presenting. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Riley, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Haynes with Fair & Pierce, part of the HDR project consulting team, and I'm planning to share some updates on the ridership forecasting process that's been underway with the project. Next slide. I thought I would start by sharing a little bit of background on what ridership forecasting is and why it's important for a project such as this. Some of you may have tuned in last fall when we had another webinar on the ridership forecasting process. So some of these slides are a little similar, but thought it would be helpful as a recap for getting into the updates on ridership today. So ridership forecasting is really a way of estimating travel demand for transit systems. It's so the process really looks at how many people might be riding a system, and also how many people might be getting on and off at individual stations. That's useful for the overall transportation planning process. It helps inform decisions about the overall project and some details about specific stations and other aspects of the project. Ridership forecasting is also beneficial because it accounts for different factors like population growth, economic trends, travel behavior trends, and preferences, and even fluctuations in seasonal travel demand. So next slide. There's a few steps involved in the ridership forecasting process. And without going into a lot of detail on each of the technical steps, at a high level, ridership is a form of modeling tool. Ridership forecasting is a form of modeling tool that accounts for factors like socioeconomic data, and then characteristics of the transportation system. So the kind of where roads are connected to one another, and then how transit networks such as bus and future rail networks might be connected to one another. That data and other information then goes into a tool called a forecast model, which looks at ways of how travel demand occurs, how many trips might occur. The second step, by which mode? Is it bicycling? Is it driving? Is it riding transit? And then that allows us, as part of that process, to look at specific ridership levels for the ZEPRT project. We can also then look at where trips start and where they go. And so that allows us to get more information and kind of look at actual travel patterns for how the system might be used in the future. So that's just a brief overview of the process of ridership forecasting. Next slide. As many of you know, the forecasts build on previous studies, and there have been several studies that have been done along the corridor over the past 20 or more years. A few things to note. In 2015, the original rail transit feasibility study looked at different rail service scenarios. And then right after that, the county developed a new travel demand model, which allows, among other things, us to forecast rail ridership for this project. That model was then used in 2021 for the alternatives analysis for the corridor. And that looked at some different rail service options and types of rail service, developed some initial forecasts for the corridor. And all of that information is then used as a basis for the current work, which started in 2024 and is presenting or developing more refined ridership forecasts. Next slide. So there's maybe some questions about ridership forecasting as to how far into the future we look. And a ridership model allows us to look at different time horizons into the future. Projects, especially transit projects, often look at an opening year, maybe when the system might originally open, but then also a future horizon year. So after the service has been open and operating for several years, and travel patterns have adjusted and normalized, and maybe additional regional growth has occurred, what might forecasts look like then? So the ridership forecast that I'm going to share today focus on a horizon year of about 20 years from now. So that's an approximate year around 2045, and kind of what would conditions look like if the ZEPRT project were operational, and some of the regional changes and travel patterns and transportation projects and population and employment changes have already occurred. Next slide. What was covered in the prior webinar and maybe is worth recapping today is that there's a combined approach that we've been using for the ZEPRT project that shortly it really gets to the best of both worlds, looking at the regional travel demand model that looks at has been developed for the county, looks at regional travel patterns and behavior, looks at broader factors, but then combining that with a more specific model called a direct ridership model that really is a custom-built statistical model that focuses on more detailed site-specific and station-specific characteristics. So combining those two tools is what the project has been doing, and allows us to look both at broader regional travel patterns, but then also individual station area characteristics, and understand how those combined might come together to allow us to better understand travel patterns. Next slide. There's a few different considerations that models often look at, and we want to make sure that we're paying attention to in a project such as this. So without going into all of the detail on these, we do want to look at broader regional factors, such as kind of how people travel between counties, like the Bay Area and elsewhere in the Monterey Bay area. But then we also look at other things, such as like commute and non-commute trips, different travel modes. I mentioned station area characteristics. We also look at things like the amount and price of parking, how that might affect travel demand and transit demand, how seasonal differences in travel activity might affect demand, and then kind of the transit system itself, how might that, as well as some of the surface transit or bus transit that connects to the rail system, might affect travel demand. So these are all factors and things that we're looking at, have been looking at, and want to make sure that we're factoring into the overall ridership process. Next slide. Quickly, a few assumptions that are detailed in the executive summary document, but these form the basis for some of the preliminary ridership forecasts that I'll be sharing today. We're assuming 30-minute service frequencies, both on weekdays and then also for weekend rail service. 9 stations throughout the corridor, running from Pajaro to Natural Bridges. We're assuming that there would be an interregional connection at Pajaro connecting to other systems. And overall, an approximately 40 to 45-minute travel time from Pajaro to Natural Bridges on the rail corridor itself. Next slide. So this gets into a little bit more detail on some of the ridership ranges that we've been developing and are looking at. We're presenting these as ranges because there's a number of factors that are still kind of being considered and could lend themselves to somewhere kind of ridership levels being somewhere within this range at individual stations. At a high level, the total ridership per day on the system during a typical weekday, we're estimating would be around 3,500 to 6,000 riders per day. And that would then be broken down into total ridership at individual stations. Ridership levels are usually presented in terms of boardings. So this would be the number of people that get on at a station, get on the train at a station throughout the day. So this is just boardings. It does that we consider alightings in the process or getting off the train, but for purposes of the numbers today, we're just focusing on boardings. You can see that the busiest station would be downtown Santa Cruz at Beach Street, that would have a range of up to 1,500 riders per day. Maybe no surprising that there's a lot of activity that occurs in and around downtown Santa Cruz and the boardwalk area. Also has some bus service that currently connects to UC Santa Cruz and could even be further enhanced in the future. So there's a lot of ridership potential in downtown Santa Cruz, and the results that we've developed so far show some of that potential. Without going into all of the stations, we see maybe a few other highlights. Downtown Watsonville also has substantial ridership numbers. Some of that is driven by the recently approved Downtown Watsonville specific plan, which envisions a fair amount of new development in the downtown area, in particular new housing. So that contributes to some of the overall ridership levels in the system. When we look at Capitola and Aptos and some of the kind of 17th Avenue, Seabright Station, and we see kind of moderate levels of ridership activity for all of those stations as well. And then Natural Bridges has maybe ridership at the lower level, though we're also noting that there's high ridership potential if bus connections that currently are in the area could provide maybe more direct or higher speed transit service to UC Santa Cruz, maybe could lend themselves to higher ridership levels at Natural Bridges. Weekend ridership we're showing is just kind of a low, medium, high scale, which you might have seen in previous presentations. So we're focusing currently on weekday ridership, but also wanting to recognize that weekend ridership is a large component of the potential here. And so these are some of the results that we're seeing. Capitola and downtown Santa Cruz have high weekend ridership potential. Next slide. This is just a different way of showing the ridership results. So you can see it shown on a map, and the size of the circle is the overall ridership range. And so Beach Street, downtown Santa Cruz, you can see the kind of highest level ridership potential there. And then some of the other stations kind of along the corridor over to Pajaro. Next slide. So we thought it would also be useful to look at how other systems might compare to Santa Cruz in terms of the total daily boardings, the ridership levels that we're seeing. And then maybe if we compare it on a per station basis. So this shows 3 other systems. So the SMART commuter rail system in the North Bay Area, in Sonoma and Marin counties. And then 2 systems in San Diego County that we've also used as comparison systems. The Coaster Service, which goes up and down the San Diego coastline, connecting to downtown San Diego. And then the Sprinter Service, which runs inland in North San Diego County and runs between Oceanside and Escondido and several points in between. So those systems, you can see in dark green, we're showing the current ridership levels compared to our midpoint of ridership for Santa Cruz. And we see like a couple systems, SMART and the Coaster being a little lower, Sprinter being a little bit higher, just looking at their existing ridership compared to our future ridership. And then if we account for some potential future growth of those systems, we're just for comparison purposes, we're saying, well, what if there's 50% additional growth in those systems over the next 20 years? The light green part of the bar just accounts for some of that growth potential that those other systems would likely or may have, and allows a little bit better apples to apples comparison. And then that shows if we look at the right chart, the daily ridership per station or on a per station basis, we're looking higher than most of the other systems based on their current ridership, and then higher than SMART and Coaster, even accounting for future ridership growth at those stations. Next slide. So we can also look at this on a per capita basis. This is just kind of accounting for the total population within these areas. So we're looking at the total population within Santa Cruz County. If we just say total ridership on a per capita basis, compare that to some of the other systems, showing that the ZEPRT system would have a larger share of total transit use within Santa Cruz County compared to maybe some of these other systems. Though with the caveat that we do have some larger population centers in some of these other areas that change some of the per capita numbers. The Coaster Service in particular connects to downtown San Diego, very large population center. So if you kind of look at it on a per capita basis, that system shows up as being a little bit lower than some of the other systems. But another useful way of comparing some of the ridership numbers. Next slide. So there's a few maps that we thought would also be useful to look at how growth might occur in the corridor and some of the population and employment changes that are contributing to some of the ridership numbers that we're seeing. So this map shows population and employment growth within different zones within Santa Cruz County. These zones are used in the travel model as part of the modeling process, but we can also map them and see in pink, we see the population growth, and then in blue, we see employment growth. And you can see how that's distributed throughout the county or anticipated to change throughout the county. Lots of growth in housing in downtown Watsonville, as I mentioned, as one example. Next slide. We can also look at that on a density basis. So if we take growth on and average it on a per square mile basis, we can combine that. You sort of see the gradations in color here. If we look at population and employment together, and we see some of the darker kind of purple colors is high population and employment densities. And then some of the other colors, maybe it's just high population, but not employment, or high employment and not population. Just another way of looking at sort of the overall density of development along the corridor. We have fairly moderate to even high levels of population, combined population and employment density, and that's beneficial oftentimes for transit demand. So that's helping kind of contribute to some of our ridership numbers here. Next slide. Also want to briefly talk about Pajaro and the interregional connection. And we're assuming that maybe about 10% of the riders would transfer or connect at Pajaro to perhaps other systems, which are shown here in the state rail plan, or maybe get on at Pajaro and then go to other locations within Santa Cruz County. The state rail plan, like I mentioned, does have a goal to connect to other systems, both to the north in Gilroy and the Bay Area, and even future high-speed rail service, and then to the south in Castroville and Monterey. We're anticipating that most of the demand for transfers would probably be to and from the north, but that there would be some potential to and from the south as well. Next slide. Station access improvements also have an effect on overall ridership. And we're noting and through the process that connectivity to other modes and accessibility, those are all important factors in contributing to how many people might use or ride the train at individual stations. And so those are another thing that is being considered as part of the direct ridership component to the forecasting process. Next slide. There's a few strategies that might be considered as part of as the designs and concepts for individual stations are considered. As part of the draft ridership results that we're seeing now, we've noted maybe some of the potential types of improvements that could be considered that would allow us to achieve maybe some of the higher ridership levels toward the higher end of the ranges that we're presenting today. So for example, those might include timed transfers to other transit systems or be they bus or other rail systems like at Pajaro. It might include park and ride lots or opportunities for people to drive or maybe get dropped off at a station and then get on at the station. It might include things like bike parking, pedestrian access improvements, maybe more direct connections to certain locations. One example might be a more direct connection to Cabrillo College from the Cabrillo State Beach Station to get across Highway 1 and allow that to be Cabrillo College to be within a much closer walking or biking distance of the station. So these are some of the potential strategies that we might consider and allow us to achieve some of the higher end of the ridership levels here. Next slide. Wanted to briefly highlight UC Santa Cruz and maybe some opportunities to think about for the connection to UC Santa Cruz. There's a lot of transit use at UC Santa Cruz today, a lot of potential for ZEPRT to contribute and be a part of that overall transportation connection. There's maybe a couple options for thinking about the connection to UC Santa Cruz. One could be a connection via Natural Bridges Station, like I mentioned earlier. So if you're getting from downtown Santa Cruz and Beach Street area to UC Santa Cruz, you could ride the train out to Natural Bridges, then get on a bus and go up to campus. That travel time might be a little longer than, say, a direct bus connection from downtown Santa Cruz, like exists today and like could maybe be enhanced in the future. But we still see kind of potential ranges or things to consider for how you might get to UC Santa Cruz to and from the ZEPRT rail system. So we've shown just a couple different options here and the approximate travel time ranges that might go along with them. Next slide. So to wrap things up, next steps. We plan to refine these results based on some of the station assumptions, like I mentioned, maybe further refinements to the overall rail service assumptions and operating plan levels, and based on kind of other factors that we might be thinking about that contribute to ridership. This will all go into a ridership report that's under development, and we'll outline and describe a lot of the things that I'm going over today. And to the extent it might be necessary, maybe future updates or refinements to the process to the extent the project description might change or evolve over time. But at least for kind of where we're at in the process today, these are our preliminary ridership results that we're excited to be sharing with you. So with that, I will stop and turn things over to the next part of the session.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. So we're going to shift gears now, and we're going to move on to the next part of our presentation this afternoon, which is on our cost estimates. Next slide. So when we look at cost estimates, there's two types of cost estimates that our project study has considered. First are the capital costs, and we'll go through what those mean here. And then secondly are the operations and maintenance costs, which will come later in the presentation this afternoon. So first, the capital costs are the design and construction of the project, the physical project itself. What we have here today is consideration for what those costs would incur, including the contingency that would be applied at this level of the project formulation, as well as other costs that would go into furthering the development of the design, including professional costs to bring it through final design, etc. So what we're looking at today are going to be presenting what would it cost for our guideway and track elements and bridge infrastructure. What would it cost for our stations and our support facilities, such as the layover facility and the maintenance facility, administrative facilities, and other structures that would need to be constructed as part of the passenger rail service. Also, our signals and systems and communication network, right-of-way acquisitions and land improvements, and land costs that would be associated with the project. The vehicles themselves, identifying hydrogen multiple unit vehicles in the project's cost. The professional services I mentioned to develop these further into final design, as well as contingency costs, which I mentioned as well. And it includes certain grading construction costs associated with the coastal rail trail as well. And that's where the trail is located within the rail corridor. But the cost estimates we're presenting today do exclude costs for the major trail structures such as bridges, as well as the cost for the trail where it would be located outside of the rail corridor. Next slide. And so the methodology developed in order to develop these cost estimates are using the quantities that are developed from the preliminary plans that were developed as part of the project when they're available, or known other values such as using a track foot cost or a square foot cost for alignment and roadways where specific data is not available for specific quantities. The pricing that was generated, it was developed using cost data from similar projects and an estimator's experience for the project. And we are presenting these cost estimates in 2025 dollars with contingency values set based on the current level of preliminary design. And with that, I believe I'm handing it over to our HDR team to present the cost estimates themselves.
Sure. Thanks, Riley. I'm Mark McLaren with HDR and been the project manager for this work. And we'd like to talk now about the capital cost estimate. I've noticed in the questions that have been coming in, there are a couple of things that I hope I can clarify as a part of the explanation of this, but understand that there will be a lot of questions. We'll get what we can to this evening and certainly respond back to others as appropriate. If you go to the next slide, Tiffany. So I guess first and foremost, to walk you through, this cost estimate is divided into a number of categories that are consistent with the way a project like this would be developed. And so when I say that, that's to mean that we have a lot of information that rolls up under each of these categories and provides an aggregate for certain types of activities. And then there are things such as contingency and professional services that go on top of that because they are done kind of holistically as it relates to some of the different activities that are included in here. I noticed that one of the questions that came up already was the question of the bridge conversation. And I think maybe that's a good way to explain this estimate, because you will recall when we presented the bridge rehabilitation and replacement cost estimate at about $980 million. It was broken into a couple of components. Those components were, first of all, the construction of the bridges themselves and all of the associated work that is included in the field for actually building the structure. It included contingency for the things that are unknowns about the project. So there's environmental mitigations, there's soil conditions, there are other things that at this stage of design, we don't have a clear understanding of yet. And so we provide a contingency within the cost estimate to address that and to make sure that if we identify something that's going to impact that cost or require additional cost, we've made an allowance for it at this stage of the project. And then thirdly is the professional services. So the design of the system in a railroad, it's all of the work to get the certifications for the startup and the operations. It's the work to help do things such as look at some of the technical conditions as it relates to, again, for example, soils and go through the environmental process. Those are all costs that are added on to then that construction cost. So the $980 million that was presented previously is included within this number this evening, but it's broken into a couple of those categories just as the way the other elements of the project are this evening. So the first category here that we talk about, which is the track elements, the bridges, the guideway, essentially, which is the track and the structures that it's going to operate on. We then include the stations, which are a separate component and oftentimes something that's constructed separately just because of the nature of the construction activity. So that's the platforms and the shelters and the amenities that are to be provided at those locations. The next one is support facilities, and this is primarily the facilities necessary to store, operate, and maintain the vehicles. So it's a yard and track infrastructure that's put in to store trains, and then also an enclosed facility that houses the equipment, the spare parts, and the other activities that will be undertaken on a daily or regular basis to make sure the trains are maintained in a state of good repair and continue to be operable. And so those costs there all roll into the first component here, or major subtotal of this cost estimate. The second part of this is the right-of-way cost. And so as we've talked throughout this process, it has been our intent to design with minimal impact outside of the railroad right-of-way. There are a few places where we've had to make some assumptions, and we know that we may have some impacts. But honestly, a big part of this is really the costs associated with the land area that would be required to accommodate the maintenance and storage facility. So it's the land to make the improvements and make that construction possible there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have the professional services. So this is all of the technical work that gets done to define the project, to take it through the various processes, and to also then develop the cost estimate and provide the services necessary that we've represented within the cost estimate, all of the activities necessary to get from where the project is today to the point that the project has been defined and has the clearance, the permits, and in fact, the work necessary, the resources necessary to get it all the way through to the beginning of operation. So again, within the cost estimate, that $980 million, as is circled here on the table now, those are the categories where those costs associated with the bridge structures and that number previously included are accounted for as a part of the project. In the questions that were presented this evening, there were a couple of other questions that I'll point to while this screen is this particular slide is up. One is the signal systems and communication. There were a couple of questions that were raised, for example, about quiet zones. And as we've talked before, the intent has been to design the system in designing the crossing protection and the signaling equipment of the system in such a way that we believe that would be eligible to be able to operate as a quiet zone. Ultimately, that is not a decision that the design dictates, but it's an operational decision that's made by the FRA as they look at how the system is going to operate in the equipment that is being included. So that is an important consideration as we talk about what's been included here. So with that, if we could go to the next slide, please. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Steve Gaskell, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the operating expense, and that being the recurring cost annually for the operations and the maintenance of the service. Steve?
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. As Mark mentioned, I'm going to go through how we developed an annual operating expense estimate. So first, just to cover what is included in that. That's vehicle operations and maintenance, also non-vehicle maintenance, so any maintenance that needs to be done to the track along the right-of-way. This also includes general administration and operations, as well as the labor for operators themselves. And finally, materials, supplies, utilities, fuel costs, all of that. So all of that is included in the annual operating expense. One thing to note that is not included in this estimate is any major maintenance or rehabilitation of structures, as well as trail costs. So that would mean if there is, a major rehabilitation of a bridge that is needed 30 years from now, we have not annualized that cost as part of this estimate. And so this estimate was based on our current operating schedule, the run times from end to end, and the headways that we would like to achieve. So next slide, thanks. So how did we come to this? We developed what's called a benchmark cost estimate. So we looked at similar passenger rail operating costs to estimate what a reasonable range might be for this passenger rail. So we selected 6 different systems to use as representative lines. Each of these systems, which I'll go through in a moment, operate a single line, a single train line, using either electric or diesel multiple unit vehicles. And then we took their annual operating expense as reported to the National Transit Database and calculated that in terms of per train revenue mile. So the assumptions that we made is that this would be an all-day end-to-end service. So that means trains run from Pajaro to West Santa Cruz every time. It would operate from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. Every day of the year, with an approximate end-to-end runtime of 45 minutes and a headway of 30 minutes. So a train would be arriving every 30 minutes in each direction. Next slide, please. So these are the 6 different systems that we used as benchmark to come up with our estimate. So we have 3 that are in California. We have the EBART, and that is the section of BART that runs from Pittsburgh to Antioch. We have the Sprinter that's in northern San Diego County, as well as SMART. And then we chose 3 from Texas. Capital Metro, which operates in Austin, TexRail, which operates from Fort Worth to Dallas, and the A Train, which operates from Denton County to Dallas. So each of these, we determined their total annual operating expense, the total train revenue miles, and then what that operating expense per train revenue mile would be in 2023 dollars because that is the last year available that we have data. One thing to note is that we have a mix of service types here, and I'll explain what these mean. A directly operated service means that the transit provider is also employing and providing the service. So in this case, right, EBART is employing the train operators and they are running the service. For a purchased transportation service, that means that for instance, while Capital Metro is the overall owner of the transit service, they are contracting out to another entity to actually operate the service. So those folks are not direct employees of Capital Metro. And so we can see there's a range, a broad range of annual operating expenses per train revenue mile here, although most of them are falling in the $50 to $60 range. Capital Metro is definitely an outlier. And we did some research to figure out why it was such an outlier and learned that it's because of the nature of their contract through which they provide the service. Next slide. So here's just a graph showing that same information. So you can see, with the exception of Cap Metro, most of these fall within kind of a general range. And the blue ones here are the purchase transportation and the green ones are the directly operated ones. So next slide. So to calculate our annual operating expense, we developed a conceptual train schedule and determined how many train revenue miles we would have to run each year. That came out to just over 500,000 train revenue miles. And then we took the average of the costs from our benchmark properties. That came out to $63.09. Multiplied those and then escalated it using inflation index to $2025, since the figures that we had were from 2023 to develop this estimate. So for 30-minute headways, which is what is the ultimate desire as envisioned in the California State Rail Plan, your average annual operating expense would be $34 million. And we also wanted to include, just as a point of comparison, what a 60-minute headway would look like. And that average annual operating expense would be $17 million. We've also included kind of a high-end range, which we're calling contingency here. But that's not additional, that's inclusive. So you can consider your range of being 34 million to 41 million. And the reason why we did that is because we are intending to run hydrogen trains. This is technology that is rapidly developing and still very new. So we want to account for that as a variable. And also understanding the historical experience of Santa Cruz Metro and their past labor agreements. So I understand there are a lot of questions coming through about why these are presented in 2025 dollars. We are doing that because of the nature of the project, and we don't have a specific operating date to use yet to advance that. And I believe that's the end of the operating. Great. So I'll hand it back to Riley.
Thank you very much. So that ends the content for our webinar today in terms of the ridership projections and the cost estimates for the project. On the next slide, we have next steps for the project. We have our draft project concept being presented at the RTC's June 12th commission meeting this week. At that time, we will also launch the online virtual open house, where much of the data that you saw today, as well as additional data that was covered in the project concept, will be presented in a format that users would be able to investigate more thoroughly the project concept information that is presented there, as well as provide some feedback and input on the virtual open house platform. The information for how to obtain or enter into the virtual open house will be presented at the June 12th meeting. We also are planning to host in-person office hours this summer as an engagement opportunity for people seeking to have additional information, seeking additional information or to ask questions. The vision for the office hours is to provide more opportunity for people in the community and stakeholders to access the project team and to ask questions in a more familiar format and a more intimate format. We're also going to, over the summer, be receiving input from the community, from stakeholders and our partner agencies. And then at the August 7th RTC Commission meeting, we'll be holding a public hearing on the draft project concept to receive additional feedback and for the Commission to ask further questions. And then in this fall, we will present the final project concept report at a future Commission meeting yet to be determined, where the Commission will have the opportunity to consider and accept the project concept report. And with that, I will hand it over to Tiffany to provide us with another review of how the question and answer session will move forward. And then we'll have an opportunity to answer questions from the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Riley, and all our presenters. Yes, we'll now move into the question and answer session. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A box on your Zoom toolbar to enter questions. We will log those and respond to as many as we can tonight. And if you're participating in the RTC conference room, you can write questions down on the paper, provide those to the staff there in the room, and they will get those over to us. I will note before we get started on the Q&A, we have many participants on this afternoon. We really appreciate that. I think this is our highest attended info session so far. As a result of that, that means we've also received nearly 100 questions already in the Q&A box. I know some have been addressed through the presentation. We'll try to group as many as we can to respond to, but we apologize if we don't get through all the questions. So with that, I'm going to read two questions that relate to each other, related to ridership, to get us started. So those two questions ask, how do you validate models and measure their performance? And along with that question, do you have any examples of modeled ridership versus actual ridership for the same project, showing whatever the difference may have been? And what level of confidence do you have in model predictions? And Riley, do you want to get us started with that response?
I do. Thank you, Tiffany. And those are great questions. For that, I'm going to ask Matt if he has an opportunity to respond. And if Matt, you need to have the question repeated, please go ahead and ask.
Great. Thanks, Riley. I think I captured the essence of both of those questions. And I'd note that those are often types of questions that come up as part of a ridership forecasting process. I think one speaks to, to the extent that how can we be confident in the results, and how are we kind of comparing things to maybe other systems that have been built. One thing to note is that the webinar from last fall did include some ridership comparisons to other systems as to how well kind of other systems like SMART and the Coaster and Sprinter service, they developed ridership forecasts before those systems were built. And now we have the benefit of those systems being up and operational for several years. And we did take a look at those. And what we found is actually the forecasting results for most of those systems were fairly consistent with the actual ridership numbers that they're seeing. And so at least in some of our comparison systems, we have the benefit of those ridership results being fairly accurate. There's a caveat there that travel patterns and conditions are changing a lot. We've all seen a lot of changes in travel demand and travel trends since COVID, and we're working to try and incorporate kind of the latest changes in travel trends into some of the models here. But we know that, yeah, there's still, we don't have that crystal ball. We have tools that we hope will be useful. And we're attempting to account for factors like post-COVID travel demand and travel patterns in our results. And using the latest modeling tools and approaches to develop the ridership forecasts that we shared today. That's one reason why we have sort of the combined approach that I was describing of the county travel demand model with the direct ridership modeling tool, where we intend to use those together. And we hope that results in an approach that gives us the best of both worlds for looking at ridership numbers. So I think hopefully that answers the question in terms of the overall process and how we're thinking about performance of the models. Maybe actually the other thing I'd note is that the county travel demand model is a model that has been validated at various points since it was originally developed over 10 years ago. And so we're using the latest version of that model that has gone through prior validation processes, collected data on regional travel patterns within Santa Cruz County, and then compared that to the model forecasts to calibrate it to have it be as accurate as possible for local travel conditions.
Thanks, Matt. And as Matt mentioned, one of our previous information sessions, just to remind everybody, all of the previous info sessions that we've done for this project are all posted on the project webpage on the RTC's website, as well as those linked to YouTube. So thanks, Matt. Okay, our next question also relates to ridership, and the question is, what is the difference between riders and boardings in numbers?
I'm happy to take that one too, Riley.
That'd be
That
great.
sounds
That'd be
good.
great, Matt. Yep.
I think that's a fairly simple question, and the answer really is they're the same. Boardings would be measured is the typical way of looking at ridership, but it's the number of people getting on the train. And so that would be the same as the total riders throughout the day. So one boarding equals one rider, if you will. And I think that's probably the most direct way of describing it. So if you hear riders, if you hear boardings, I would consider those the same.
Okay, thank you. The next question is going to relate to both ridership and cost. And the question asks, in the TCAA, the Transit Corridor Alternatives Analysis that was prepared in 2020, light rail forecast higher ridership than commuter rail. Would we have high ridership if we included more stops? And then related to that, we also have a question asking if the cost estimates included a light rail version. So Riley, I will let you get started with that one.
Perfect. And I'll answer part of it and then get over to Matt for the second half of the question. So to answer, was light rail included in the cost estimate? And the answer is no. Light rail itself was not specifically costed out as an option for the zero emission passenger rail and trail cost estimates that we presented today. The reason being is that at the March 20th commission meeting, the RTC commission directed staff to align the zero emission passenger rail and trail project with the vision of the state rail plan, which was intercity rail on the Santa Cruz branch rail line. And I think to answer one of the other questions I saw to come through as well, yes, the Santa Cruz branch rail line is included in the state rail plan and is a spur of the Central Coast corridor, which is included in the federally corridor identification development program corridor for the Central Coast corridor. So I'll let Matt go into some more detail on it, but Generally speaking, when you look at ridership and the number of stations do go hand in hand and are interrelated. But along with that is also the trade-off that when you have a bigger, larger number of stations or stops, the travel time for the system increases, and that also affects ridership. So, Matt, with that, I'll toss it over to you, and you can expand just a little bit on how that affects the ridership numbers and um, how that would interplay with a light rail system. Where are we to look at that?
Sure, happy to describe that, but I think you hit the nail on the head. Overall, is that in ridership forecasting and even thinking about kind of how people travel in general, sure, it might be convenient to have a rail stop maybe closer to where you live or to where you work. But if that's not something that's kind of part of the overall kind of current plan, you're adding a rail stop and you slow down the rail service for everybody else. So there is that trade-off that's inherent in transit, kind of thinking about transit stops and locations as part of the project team's discussions and kind of thinking about the ridership. We've attempted to sort of find that right balance between the optimal number of stations that kind of gets to a lot of where the travel demand originates and ends, so where population and employment centers are, but to balance that against maybe that need to or that kind of desire to have more stops that would slow down the overall service. And so we wouldn't achieve those levels of a 40 to 45 minute end-to-end travel time if we added several stops along the way. So we've attempted to strike that right balance in the ridership process so far. We've also looked at the type of rail service. Light rail service does oftentimes have more stops, but maybe slightly lower capacities on the trains compared to other types of trains. That was looked at in detail in the transit corridor alternatives analysis several years ago. And I say that a lot of those forecasts are helpful in looking at the trade-offs between different types of transit. We focus sort of on the ZEPRT type service and the ridership forecast here. But for comparison purposes, I think the TCAA ridership results do show some of those differences between different types of transit technologies.
Back to you, Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you both. My next set of questions kind of speak to the need for a little bit of clarification around what future-looking elements we're including here related to ridership. So I'm going to read two of these questions. Hopefully, Riley and Matt, you can speak to this a little better. The first one is, does this future ridership estimate assume we build 100% of the housing elements? And what is the projected population you're using for this? And then related to that, there's a question that the executive summary seemed to indicate that additional housing that will be built by our horizon year were not included in the ridership study, such as the Santa Cruz downtown expansion project and the Watsonville housing element. And the question is, why were these housing elements not included? So I know that was a handful, but maybe we can speak to what elements have been included and why or why not.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, I think that question gets at a couple different things, but we can probably summarize it pretty quickly in terms of what the study looked at and how the ridership projections were put together. And I think part of that comes from the executive summary, as was mentioned in the question, tells us that specifically the downtown specific plan, the Watsonville downtown specific plan, which is an adopted plan, was included in developing the projections for ridership, whereas some of the other elements of land use planning for Santa Cruz County may not have been specifically included in the ridership modeling. So I think, and then, to get to our housing element quotas and as determined by the state of California, some of these specific plans and general plan updates are making it possible for the community to reach those numbers. But I think, Matt, can you just speak specifically as to differentiating between like the Watsonville specific downtown plan versus how we incorporate the kind of general growth projections for our community that may be captured by like a future general plan update?
Absolutely, happy to. Yeah, understanding local land use plans as well as kind of broader kind of growth projections is a key part of the ridership process. I will say that that any adopted plan, we're at this point attempting to include all of the growth that is assumed as part of an adopted and fully approved plan. So that would include, for example, like Riley mentioned, the downtown Watsonville specific plan, which did envision a fair amount of growth in the downtown area of Watsonville and was adopted within the last couple of years. The county of Santa Cruz recently adopted a new general plan that governed growth and throughout the county. And those numbers are incorporated into the ridership projections. For planning efforts that are underway or maybe don't have a plan that is fully adopted, those aren't yet included, but to the extent that it might be appropriate to do so once those plans maybe are fully adopted, I think we recently, I think, had the downtown expansion plan in Santa Cruz get adopted, or at least it's in that final approval process. So to the extent that that might be something to consider in kind of future refinements, we would do so. But at this point, the ridership forecasts are based on everything that has been adopted and approved throughout the county. But we also are attempting to track and monitor efforts that are underway and may be approved at some point in the near future.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, the downtown expansion plan, for instance, is recommended for adoption, but not yet adopted by the city. Thank you for that answer. And back to you, Tiffany.
All right. Our next question also relates to ridership and stations. And the question asks, it looks as though the 41st Avenue rail stop was eliminated, which doesn't make sense because it's close to significant shopping and therefore allows access to shopping for people coming directly from neighborhoods along the rail line. It would be ideal if every rail stop does not need to be a big long station, but can be a simpler stop, more like a bus stop. This also speaks to the area around Ohlone Parkway that has a large population. And the question asks, why would two of the most potentially used stops be eliminated, especially when this could undermine optimizing service to commuters and regular shoppers? Ideally, we want regular shoppers and commuters to avoid driving. And I think I will pause there. Riley, let you start that one.
Yep. So thinking back to Matt's earlier question, or answer to the question about the number of stations that we have versus the travel time, and how when we look at developing a system, you're trying to balance those two. And while it may seem advantageous to put a large number of stops in to be able to make it more convenient for more people to access the train and the service, when you're doing that, you're adding travel time and therefore kind of increasing the time that a rider would need to travel on the train, and therefore there's a balance in there where you're trying to optimize both of them. If you have too long of a travel time, then you're going to lose ridership. And I think Mark, you might have an opportunity to explain particularly like the 41st Avenue station and what our thought was with more detail on consolidating that with the other Capitola station.
Yeah, sure. As we went through, and it was not a part of the presentation this evening, but it will be a part of I think it's part of the broader conversation. It's also on the virtual open house material that would be available here for you to review and comment on over the summer. But as we went through and looked at the travel time and looked at finding that sweet spot between the number of stations, the travel time, and what it means for ridership, Matt and his team went through and prioritized all of the station locations that had been looked at initially. And that was from two perspectives. One was looking at the propensity of those stations to specifically attract riders who are looking at, say, work or school trips. And then the others were for other activities. So not a traditional trip that you make 5 days a week, but whether it's, say, going somewhere in the evening, going just somewhere for a day to lunch, to a shorter trip or shopping, and taking those into account. And from that conversation, we prioritized then and looked at the stations and then compared them back to the work that Matt and his team had done as a part of the TCAA study to look at what the balance was between some of those locations and what made the most sense. Is this project and this process continue to move forward? Those are certainly things that can continue to be evaluated and looked at, and will be looked at as we take this project through the environmental process. But the locations and the way that they were prioritized and selected were the things that we knew from data and from the work that Matt and his team has done before, were the locations that were had the highest likelihood of best serving the travel markets in the corridor. I will point out, because again, there were a lot of questions in here about ridership. And there are a couple that had to do with the travel time specifically, and whether or not we had looked at it from the comparison, for example, of the time to drive from, say, from Santa Cruz to Watsonville. And right now at a travel time of 45 minutes, that's pretty competitive with the time it would take you to drive in a car. Obviously, there are times of the day where that drive time is more significant, and that's the time of day you might be more apt to take the train versus drive because of the time advantage that you have. And those are all things that also influence that determination on making that trip. If we add stations, there was another question here about dwell time. So that's when a train pulls into the station, how long is it going to sit for people to get on and off the train and then continue on its way? For modeling and operations purposes, basically, for the time it takes the train to slow down, come into a station, stop for about a minute, and then or a minute and a half, and then begin on its way out of the station again, basically adds 2 minutes to the travel time. So if you look at the length of the line, and let's just say we added 3 stations and that adds 6 minutes, now with that trip being closer to an hour, is that going to be less influential to people in terms of them making a different choice in terms of how they travel? It is a chess game that will continue and always continues through the project development process and refinement. But again, we welcome the comment and the questions at this point. With the work that we've done and what we've collected, we believe that we're in a good spot in terms of the competitiveness of the number of stations and the time that it would take to travel the line. Riley?
Thank you, Mark. And back to you, Tiffany.
Sure. The next question we have is asking if we could speak to how capital cost contingencies are determined.
Yep. Thank you, Tiffany. So in a nutshell, the contingencies are determined based on the level of design that you have, as well as basically how many of the questions that we have about what the final design would look like are still unanswered. For maybe just a little bit further detail on that, Mark, can you explain how we developed our contingency for this cost estimates?
Sure, be glad to. So I think it's the easiest way to define this is that it's a way of managing risk. With the degree of design and what we know about the project at this point. There are a lot of things that continue to be unknowns that will evolve through the environmental process. And as we learn more about site conditions as a project moves into final design. And the risk is that we learn something that we don't know right now, and that pushes the cost of the project up over time. Many of the particularly federal agencies that provide grant funding for projects such as this one have guidelines in terms of how much contingency should be at a minimum carried at different stages of a project. And at this stage, that range is typically in the range of 30 to 35%. Understanding that when we believe that there's a greater risk in terms of unknowns, that there may be additional risk that's added to accommodate for that. So you will recall in the conversation we had specifically about the bridges and the buildup of the cost of the bridges, one of the big concerns is the availability of skilled crews and the ability to access and mobilize a construction crew within some of the bridge areas given where those bridges are located. And so in that case, for the bridge construction, we increased the contingency rate to 50% just for the bridge construction. But for the other elements of the project, primarily have kept that risk in the 30 to 35% range. So overall, as a number, it's closer to 40%. I'm sorry, I don't remember the number off the top of my head. But it's variable depending on the risk that's associated with some of the individual elements of the project. The idea with contingency is as we answer questions and we get more knowledgeable about the environmental situations, the things we have to address as it relates to mitigation, as we understand soil conditions and what that means for bridge construction. If we don't use that contingency because we didn't learn something that is going to cost more, then that's a risk that we essentially retire and the contingency will start to come down. But at this point, it's essentially the insurance policy to make sure that as a project moves forward, there aren't risks that come forward that would significantly impact the cost of the project in a way that's detrimental to the ability to achieve it. Riley?
Thank you, Mark. And I
All
think
right.
one thing just to highlight there is, while we've done some specific contingency consideration for the project, it's consistent with what you would see with other federal programs at this level of a project design. Back to you, Tiffany.
Thanks. I'm going to shift us back to another ridership question. And this question asks, if ridership demand exceeds initial projections, can trains be expanded with additional units, or could service frequency be increased with no change in the number of units per train? So how would we address ridership exceeding initial projections?
Great, thank you, Tiffany. And yes, multiple unit vehicles that we've been looking at are vehicles that have the capability of adding additional cars to the multiple unit set. So for instance, if we see through ridership that there's a need for increased capacity, say in the peak morning hours, those certain train sets you could add additional cars to those trains and therefore provide for additional capacity. Or if you needed the capacity throughout the day, you could have the cars be added to the vehicles for the whole portion of the day. Mark, is there anything to add on that?
No, that's a fair way to explain it, Riley, and a good question, because there are systems that do experience that where despite how far ridership forecasting has come as a science, as Matt explained, to being pretty accurate in terms of what agencies have experienced, there are those cases where we see projects that in fact exceed the ridership forecasts. And so the ability to have flexibility and add more capacity in the system is an important part of the conversation. It's easier to add the capacity in a train than it is in the frequency of the service, only in that the line has to have certain accommodations to allow trains to pass in certain locations, and also what that means in terms of the operation of traffic and other things. But certainly we have the ability to do that through adding capacity within a multiple unit.
Great. Back to you, Tiffany.
Thanks. I'm going to shift us to a cost question now. And I've seen a few questions come in related to Beach Street in Santa Cruz. Those questions, one asks what cost and solution is included in the cost estimate for Beach Street and the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk area. And I believe another question similarly asked, how can that area be designed to save cost?
Okay. So for the purpose of developing the cost estimates that were presented today, the at-grade alignment has been considered as our baseline alignment. Now, for those who have had the opportunity to read the executive summary already, which was posted on Friday, the area of Beach Street is still an area where there's some refinement that needs to happen, and where the project team and the commission are going to be continuing the conversation with stakeholders in that area to refine the project and work through some of the complex issues there. And we'll elaborate that on that topic a bit more on Thursday for those of you who are joining us at the commission meeting. I think in terms of looking at the cost through that area, it's challenging to bring down the costs through the Beach Street area. The at-grade alignment does include the costs that would be associated with not only the tracks through the area and developing what we call the guideway area. So that would include maybe some retaining walls where needed, but also includes the fencing and the crossing improvements that would be required for pedestrian safety through the area. Whereas things that we might look at in terms of making the system through the Beach Street area work more efficiently, such as maybe a grade separated pedestrian crossing or other features that would be in addition to the at-grade alignment, those costs would likely increase the project cost from what is considered in the cost estimate today. Anything to add, Mark?
No, I think that's a fair summary of. Agreed.
Back to you, Tiffany.
All right, thanks. The next question is a clarifying question referring to the term ridership. When we state 3,500 to 6,000 in the year 2045, it appears that we define that as boardings. In other words, are we saying that the prediction is 3,500 to 6,000 boardings per weekday?
Matt, I will pose this one over to you.
Yes, that is correct. So that would be when we're referring to ridership in general, it would be referring to boardings. I think I'll use this time to briefly clarify one of the other questions, because I saw there was another comment related to the boardings versus people. I had said that they were the same. I think the one slight amendment to that would be if, say, I get on the train in Watsonville in the morning, commute to work in Santa Cruz, and then in the afternoon, I get on the train in Santa Cruz and commute back home to Watsonville, that would be 2 boardings. I would be the same person. So like maybe that's the slight amendment to kind of boardings generally equals kind of people. But if I'm taking 2 trips, that would count as 2 boardings in terms of the ridership numbers that we're talking about here, even though I'm the same person. So generally, yeah, we want to be thinking in terms of boardings. Hopefully that's clear for some of the terms that are being discussed today.
Great, thank you, Matt. Appreciate the clarification. Back to you, Tiffany.
Sure. Thanks, Riley. We have a few questions related to the funding for the project. So, for example, one of the questions says the full $4+ billion for the project couldn't all be coming from federal train incentive grants. Where would the rest of funding for the project come from?
Okay, it's a great question. And I did see several that were asking the similar vein. Yes, when you're looking at and Mark, you'll fill in the gaps for me after I give a brief answer, but when you look at a train, a passenger rail service such as this one, there will be federal investment in a project like this, or at least that's the expectation. Um, and any federal investment, they're going to be looking at partners, the state and local partners that will be participating. And there's an expectation that there would be local participation as well. When you look at the different programs available, there's generally a range with historically that there might be a maximum federal participation of about 50% through the Federal Transit Administration. Whereas with the Federal Railroad Administration's program, the Corridor Identification and Development Program, which we've mentioned earlier today, that program does have 80% potential match for intercity rail program or service. Now that is caveated with, those funds have to be available at the federal level. And that corridor ID program is meant to develop what they call a pipeline of projects for federal investment throughout the nation to be ready for construction. And that would be likely through the federal state partnership program of the Federal Railroad Administration, which also could invest up to that 80% federal match. But there would be a local investment required match, and that could be shared between the state and the local partners. We would not expect that the state would pony up 20% match, and the locals would not share in that cost share. So there would be an expectation that the local Santa Cruz County community would need to participate and provide part of that match to the Federal Railroad Administration and then the state partners as well. Matt or Mark, do you have any other additions to that?
No, I think that's a good summary of that, Riley. And while we've had a lot of conversation as a part of this process, specifically focused on the two primary discretionary programs of both the FRA and the FTA, through the Corridor ID program, as well as through the Capital Investment Grant Program, and they do have varying levels and expectations. There's a lot of other programs out there that provide for other things that may be associated with or might similarly support elements of a project or a program or be an added benefit to it. And part of the conversation that will take place as this project continues to evolve is understanding not only the timeline for development of the project, but what the most achievable or most attainable funding sources are at the various stages of the project to ensure that what has been maximized is your ability as a community to draw on not only the federal money, but also the state resources to help match that requirement.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
It's good to highlight that what we see today in the grant landscape might not be the same in a few years' time or several years' time, depending on our timelines for the continued progression of the project. And I think given that we're just at 5 o'clock, we have time for one more question, Tiffany.
Yeah, and there's been a few questions that have come in related to the topic you were just on that have asked about next steps and what happens if the RTC Commission approves the project concept this fall. So maybe you could speak briefly to what the next steps are.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. And like I mentioned for the answer to one of the other questions, we're going to be elaborating on this on our June 12th presentation to the RTC Commission this Thursday. Obviously, close at hand would be to complete the project concept report, which we anticipate being considered by the Commission in the fall for acceptance. And there's going to be continued engagement with the community and stakeholders throughout the summer months, as well as even after the project concept report is considered by the Commission in the fall. As Mark mentioned, we're going to always continue to look at state and federal funding sources, grant opportunities for completing the environmental document of this project, as well as looking for opportunities for identifying projects of independent utility along the branch line that we could seek grant funding for and make improvements or rehabilitations to the branch line to make it more competitive for these competitive discretionary funding sources. And Mark, there's one thing we added to that conversation earlier today when we were preparing for this Thursday presentation. I'm forgetting the additional item that we mentioned.
I'll have to admit that I am too.
Okay, I'll look at my notes here. I know I have it.
No, but I think it was really the conversation about continuing to work, particularly with Caltrans and the CID program.
That's right.
Because
Yeah.
the Caltrans as a proponent in that program, and the state of California being one of the few states that's very well organized in terms of how they're engaging in that conversation, is going to be there to help you through a process as an advocate for you, ultimately to achieve what you want to achieve in terms of this project in a way that is mutually beneficial, obviously, for the state and the other projects that make up, as Riley defined, what Caltrans refers to as the Central Coast Corridor. So that's a very big positive, because in the federal funding conversation, California has committed money that it is a part of their commitment to that program and bringing more federal money into the program. And as a part of that, they're also making sure that the projects are advancing in a way that they're maximizing the opportunity from the program and able to move forward successfully.
Yeah, and I think something sparking in my mind about as we work with the Caltrans partners and our Central Coast Corridor partners to further develop the service development plan for the Central Coast Corridor. One big item that comes out of that process is our implementation program for service in the Central Coast Corridor, including the Santa Cruz Branch rail line. So that implementation program outlines the steps that are going to be needed to be undertaken in order to bring service on the corridor in line with the service development plan. So that implementation program really outlines the key steps that will need to happen in order to bring us into the next step of the program. So for instance, identifying key things on the Santa Cruz Branch rail line associated with governance and operators, as well as continuing to progress the environmental document, are things that our staff and our project team will be looking at. And as I mentioned, we will be presenting more on this topic on Thursday. So stay tuned, and we do invite everybody to come out to the meeting, either virtually or in person in Watsonville this Thursday evening to get some additional information. But that does wrap us up for this evening. I do want to really appreciate everybody who participated today, all the questions that we had come through. As Tiffany mentioned, we had quite a number, our highest number of questions submitted, and we unfortunately weren't able to answer all of them this evening. But I've been taking notes, and so has the team. There are several things that I've identified, and the team has as well, that we can include in our presentation on Thursday and in materials that come out through the summer to answer some of these questions more specifically. To stay involved, we do invite everybody that's either participating with us this afternoon or who's viewing this presentation later to sign up for our mailing list if you would like to get the latest updates on the project. You can go to our project website, scrtc.org/ZEPRT, to sign up for our mailing list and also to get updates and visit the website for further information. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we do have the virtual online open house that will be launching this week. That will be at ZEPRT.com. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Tiffany.
That sounds correct, yeah.
All right. And then you can email us at ZEPRT@scrtc.org or call into the office with any questions, and do participate in our upcoming open house or office hours, where we invite you to come in and talk to the project team and ask your questions. This Thursday, we're providing some more information on those opportunities, as well as some specific dates as those are finalized. We'll send those out to our mailing list and on our project website. So back to you, Tiffany, with the closing remarks.
Yeah, again, Riley said, but we really appreciate everybody's time this afternoon, and we hope you have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.